Welcome to Identity Capital Podcast. I am Ahmed AlTammar, along with Mark Bebawi. We bring you stories from the best, where professionals share with us a timeline of their experiences in life and how they have made it in the real world. Join us in the exciting journeys of those who see things differently and believe they can change the world. Find Identity Capital on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and more. Our guest today is Tom Kolditz. He is the founding director of the Ann and John Doerr Institute for New Leaders at Rice University. The Doerr Institute was recognized in 2019 as the top university leader development program by the Association of Leadership Educators and named the fourth leader development program in the world by Global Gurus London. Prior to Rice, he taught as a professor in the practice of leadership and management and director of the leadership development program at the Yale School of Management. A retired Brigadier General, Tom led the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at West Point for 12 years. In that role, he was responsible for West Point's teaching, research, and outreach activities in management, leader development science, psychology, and sociology, and was titled Professor Emeritus after retirement. A highly experienced global leader, General Kolditz has more than 35 years in leadership role on 4 continents. His career has focused on either leading organization himself or studying leadership and leadership policy across sectors. He served for 2 years as leadership and human resources policy analyst in the Pentagon, a year as a concept developer in the Center for Army Leadership, and was the founding director of the West Point Leadership Center. General Kolditz is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, the Army highest award for service. Dr. Kolditz has published more than 75 books, book chapters, and articles across diverse array of academic and leadership trade journals. His book on that topic, An Extremist Leadership, Leading as if your life depending on it, is a book of our focus in this episode. Without further ado, hey Tom, how are you?
I am fabulous as always.
It's good to have you. In the past 2 years, it's been very difficult for everybody. During COVID, there was a lot of challenges. How was it for you?
Well, it was a real learning experience. Not only in running the Doerr Institute and making sure that we could still deliver for Rice students, which we did, but I also worked for 3 months for PepsiCo. Working with their senior leadership on how to manage this giant company when they had so many challenges with delivery. You know, their trucks still delivered product all throughout the pandemic, exposing their employees in necessary ways, and they were very well led during the whole thing. So it was a learning experience. I learned a lot about myself and a lot about how the world works.
This is actually a good point to my next question. You mentioned it's a learning experience. You've been in leadership for a long time, and you're still learning. So a lot of people feel like learning stops at college and work starts. So how important is it to keep learning and update, there's technology, there's challenges, or being prepared even for challenges?
Well, learning is probably the most critical orientation that a leader can have because of a number of reasons. First of all, leadership is very, very difficult. And even if you think you're good at it, you're probably still learning or need to learn. And so it's, I think, important for leaders to always focus on learning. The other thing that's very important about learning is that it is an outward orientation on the world that's influencing you and on new knowledge, novel circumstances. And the alternative is to turn inside oneself, to lose that outward orientation where you're in touch with reality, and to all of a sudden be living inside yourself, which is not a good posture for a leader at all. So I think it's very critical that leaders continue to learn.
In your book, In Extremist Leadership, you touch on that point. Actually, I used it yesterday during a session, and it helped me a lot, which is thinking outward. That principle is simple. It just helps a lot. But going back to your learning piece, and extreme leaders, rank the attributes different than any other discipline. So learning actually come up first. So being a leader requires you seeing around and calibrating and choosing the right leadership approach. For a lot of people, leadership sounds like quote unquote luxury, because a lot of people really don't know how to get hold of leadership. They think sometimes people are born with leadership. So I want to just go back and examine the story, a timeline of Tom, and maybe we'll go back and circle back all the way to some attributes that led you to be the leader you are today. So going back, there is a poet, Gibran Khalil Gibran, talks about the nature of people and where they come from influence their lives, their character and development. I know you are from a German ancestry. Growing up, how was Tom?
Growing up, I had a lot of supervision. I grew up in a town of 1,800 people in southern Illinois, and it was all German settled for the most part, which is very common in southern Illinois, southern Missouri, southern Indiana, that part of the country. And I was probably in my late teens before I met anyone who didn't know who my parents were. There was nowhere I could go in town where people didn't know who I was and who my parents were. And as a result, I probably got more supervision than I really wanted. And at the same time, in a small town environment like that, everyone's values are manifested all the time. If you lie to someone in a town like that, they'll talk about it for 5 years and remember it for 50. And so living in that kind of isolation almost, this small town environment was very developmental for me in terms of my values, in terms of being honest and truthful. My parents were both leaders in the community. My father was on the school board. He had an engineering company. At the time, I thought we were quite wealthy, and it wasn't until I went to Vanderbilt University that I realized we were probably lower middle class. But, I felt that way when I was growing up. My mother was a Washington University nurse, and she quit working when my brother and I were born, but she continued to take care of literally everyone in that town, taking their blood pressure, giving them injections, doing basic nursing. And so for me, being a leader was a foregone conclusion. It was expected. And it was very hard to slip out of that role without someone correcting me, without someone pulling me back into it. And I remember very clearly when I was in first grade, my first grade teacher once pulled me aside, and all the other kids were out at recess. And she said, Now, Tommy, I want you to go out there and get all the children and have them come in, because we have to be inside now. But don't be bossy or they won't listen to you. And later I realized she was teaching me to lead. When I was 6 years old, she didn't do that for everyone in the class. And I'm not sure why, but she did. I mean, I know that that's what she was doing. And she probably wouldn't have articulated it as, quote, teaching me to lead, unquote. She probably would have just said something about I had influence over kids, or, she just wanted me to learn to work with people. But that's what my youth was like. my brother and I were both Eagle Scouts. My father was an Eagle Scout in 1946. So this notion of leading and being competent, being able to tie a knot when you needed to, understanding the conservation of natural resources. All of this played into my youth.
It's a great way to understand that there's work needs to be done from early childhood for the mental development. I have a story I want to go back to, which is about your grandmother. So you and your brother was taught leadership from your grandmother, and you talk about her like she had ingrained values in you and your brother. Could you talk about how even grandparents have a role in doing this from early age, and why values matter?
Sure. So yeah, my grandparents and even my great-grandparents, who we would stay with, anytime my parents wanted to go out to dinner or something like that, we didn't generally have babysitters per se. We'd just get dropped off at the grandparents. And when you're surrounded by people who show a consistency in their values, same as my parents, same as them, same as their parents, values become deeply embedded. You pull some value out of the air, like integrity, for example. Well, if you're exposed to integrity in one place and a lack of integrity in others, it creates this instability and confusion in what you really believe is the right thing. And so I was exposed to a lot of consistency in that as a young person. I was expected to be able to parrot back, what we believed. And so my grandparents and great-grandparents were really important to me. And all of them were really well known in their own way in this small town or the neighboring town. There was a town also a similar size that was about 5 miles away, which is where my great-grandmother lived. And she was in her early 90s. And one of the things that characterized her was that she hated for there to be any kind of dirt or debris in front of her home. It was always picked up. And I can remember telling people about my great-grandmother who didn't necessarily know our family, and I described where she lived, and they would say, "Oh, that's the kind old lady that sweeps the street." because she would literally sweep the street in front of her house.
That's amazing.
And so she had a persistence and a commitment to excellence and detail that was good to learn. And I learned it because she'd have me out there sweeping the streets. So yeah, family can be a huge help in the development of leaders. And I know that not everyone has that advantage. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm inspired to help people a little bit later in life, because all of them didn't have the same kinds of advantages as I had. And but it is important, if possible, that you see that kind of consistency throughout.
It brings us to a great segue to diving deeper in leadership, but I'll end with this. Discipline. So there has to be a discipline. But if there's parents, grandparents, different opinions, right? So if you do a mistake, when did you learn and how important it is to actually deal with negative or positive feedback from people? Because this is an important leadership, as you talk in your book later on. Leaders should not come out of enthusiastic approach if it's an extremist leadership, right? But I think it's very related to childhood, to maybe coming towards leadership style. Where do people start in dealing with criticism? The book here, the first words I loved, it talks about leaders should take a decision. Sometimes they might get fired. Sometimes they might lose their job. but sometimes it might die. So could you touch on that?
Well, sure. Growing up, my job was not disappointing my parents. I mean, that was probably the most profound influence in my life, is that I didn't want to disappoint my parents. I didn't care very much if I made them angry, but if I disappointed them, that to me was the ultimate failure. And so I began, being a leader with one of the fundamental characteristics of leadership and personality, which is conscientiousness. It's one of the big 5 personality traits that associates people with being good leaders. This notion that you have to be, committed, internally committed to doing a good job, to helping people, to driving results, and so forth, is conscientiousness. And so initially it was practically a shame culture. I mean, you couldn't, when you made a mistake, you were going to feel really bad about it. But that was countered by the fact that it was pretty obvious that both my parents, but especially my mother, loved me very much. They would have forgiven anything I did if I was honest about it to them. And so there was this balance of tremendous pressure to do the right thing, to be conscientious, followed up with almost complete forgiveness when you fell short. Now, my father was a little tougher. I mean, he had a toughness to him, and still does, by the way. He's going to be 92 next month, and he still plays golf twice a week.
Oh, wow.
So he's in good shape, and unfortunately, my mother died several years ago, but
sorry about that.
He was tougher. It was kind of good cop, bad cop at our house.
That's a good balance.
Yeah, right.
It's leading with character. What does that mean? A lot of people, don't really understand beyond leadership, but maybe you can explain that.
What people need in leaders is consistency. And if a leader says something, they do it. And consequently, if you don't have the strength of personality, the character, to follow through on your commitments, to be honest with people, to make sure that you're consistent in both your words and your actions, it's very hard to lead. It's very hard for people to decide to follow. And unfortunately, that's almost non-existent in our political leadership right now. A very disappointing turn for so many leaders to be flip-flopping, inconsistent, accepting lies. But for those of us in more simpler circumstances where we're leading in our jobs or in our family lives or whatever, consistency and leading with character is what causes people to trust us. Trust is the foundation of leadership, particularly in dangerous places, because a place is dangerous because of uncertainty surrounding the future. If you're on the battlefield and you know where the enemy is and what their plans are, it's not dangerous anymore. You can always fix it. But in a context where you don't have answers for people, you can't predict the future, you have this uncertainty, why should they listen to you? Well, because they trust you. Trust and interpersonal influence is what fills in the gap when you don't have enough information in order to manage. So management brings in resources and policies and decisions and so on and so forth, which are always based on information and certainty. And so when you have uncertainty, what do you have left? You have trust. and leadership. That's it. So that's why.
This is actually it goes back to something on your book that talks about intrinsic leadership, where extremist leaders on the field, if we compare, you compared wages, and almost they are very low in average, and there's no big differences. And you talk about the effect of leading on the field because money is not the main issue people look for when they go to the field. So it's an interesting comparison because it comes as pure that if somebody dies, money is not going to do anything for them anyway. So leadership comes from the inside and actually affects the way people interact with each other. So that's why teams are stronger, because there's trust. They have to trust each other. All the interviews you did, there's a common thread. People talked about how important it is for their leaders to really care. In the past 10, 15 years, when I was in the workforce, there was a trend in how companies become so big. There's a loss in terms of giving shareholders or employees more of the benefit of having trust back and forth. It was more of focusing on really value in terms of dollar. How could we take these leadership skills where human is in the center of everything to the corporate world, and maybe value creation would actually be something that affects the economy in a better way?
Yeah, so there's a strange relationship between earning money for what you do and leading in the context of it. And one of the things I found when I studied these leaders who were in life and death situations all the time was that they didn't care very much about money. I mean, they didn't make very much for the most part, whether they were in the military or they were mountain climbing guides or skydiving organizers. Mm-hmm. And as a result, no one ever suspected that they would make decisions based on the money they were getting. The decisions all get made around people, around what's the right thing to do, what's the smart thing to do. I would be scared to death if I had a climbing guide who got paid on the basis of how far he got me up the mountain. Because I'd be afraid they'd take risks that were not appropriate. When I was in the military, quite honestly, I had little awareness of what I was paid, ever. The money went straight into our checking account. My wife spent it all. Not all, but I mean, she did most of the management of the money and purchases and things. I was focused on my soldiers. And I knew when I was an Army major that the major standing next to me was making exactly the same as I was, even if I was doing more work or what have you. So the idea of money just kind of went away. And what that means is it wasn't about external rewards. It was about doing the right thing. It was about being effective, personally effective. I could still be very aspirational and work very hard to achieve success, but success had nothing to do with how much money I was making. That's exactly what corporate America needs in their senior leadership, and they don't have it. I mean, I read an article yesterday about some sort of brouhaha that Jamie Dimon from, running the world's biggest bank, was supposed to get $84 million in remuneration, and some people thought it wasn't enough. Some people thought it was too much. I think people should be paid well for what they do, but from a leadership standpoint, the more you can divorce the leader from external rewards, the more they will put their internal focus on what they're doing, and the better off we'll all be. One of the things we found at the Doerr Institute, by the way, training students, is that we work very hard not to give them any external rewards. So we don't give them class credit. We give them a little LinkedIn badge, just to mark the fact that they work for us. And then we give them a letter that says how they can write this on their resume so that it'll be most effective for them. But we try not to give certificates or course credits or anything like that, because we want young people that are focused on learning to lead for themselves, not because they're going to get a chip from us. Internally driven leaders are far and away the best. Tons of research support that, but sometimes we don't act that way.
Now I know I don't have certificates from the couple of classes I took you guys. Actually, it does work.
Do you mind if I jump in with
Absolutely.
one quick question? To me, it sounds like the simplified air that has become politics and discussion of politics in this country and many other countries. It makes it really hard to have an intelligent conversation where it is okay to say something that sounds like it contradicts a core value. So, for example, when you say if you motivate people externally, financially, for example, with how they perform as leaders, then they don't lead for the right reasons, and maybe you attract the wrong people into that position and that kind of thing, which sounds at the superficial level of most coverage of this kind of stuff like, well, that's anti-capitalist, that's anti-American, how could you say this? I think the importance of, Ahmed's idea, this thing that we're trying to pull together, is to create enough space in conversation where you can say things and then have a little bit of extra time to explain the subtleties, rather than just have a label put on you. Oh, you worked with PepsiCo, you must be a corporate capitalist. But then you're saying something that doesn't sound like the typical corporate capitalist.
Yeah.
And so it's to make people think about how can I actually navigate between what my principles are, what the system says I should be trying to do, and actually get to a place where I'm doing both, helping the company and the people who are working there. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really a question, it was more like attempting to explain what we're
that.
doing and how someone like you navigates that in real life. Because that's really the audience with the way.
There's always fear that if you speak up, you'll get persecuted. So people sometimes don't. And your point is it's okay, or labeled.
At least.
So your point is actually spot on. I'll give you an example. Milton Friedman in 1970 introduced this idea where the benefit is for the shareholders. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, has a different opinion. He focused customers were the focus. And now you can see where capitalism today, it's not what it used to be, right? So Adam Smith's society actually bring this idea forward where people has to argue both sides of the aisle, and things has to change. If things keep going the way they are without checks and balances, there's a big risk of things not turning the way they should be. And this is actually part of the book you talk about. But I'll jump to something about Utah Steve.
We only have about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay.
Time flies when you're having a good conversation.
Absolutely. So Utah Steve, I had an experience with him. That book made me laugh, made me, all the emotions were mixed all over the stories, but talk about Utah Steve. I think that that experience was great.
Sure.
In terms of fear.
Yeah. Well, Utah Steve is a well-known skydiver in New York. He's been in many movies as a skydiver, well-respected, and he's the person who was my trainer and certifier for me to take people on tandem jumps. So a tandem parachute, as many people know, is one that takes two people. You have an experienced person on the back and an inexperienced person on front. And it's very safe, a very safe way to parachute. It's kind of, if I could draw an analogy, it's like if a skiing instructor put his or her skis on the outside of yours and just took you very slowly down the mountain. That's what a tandem parachute jump is the equivalent of. But if the instructor isn't skilled and doesn't understand the dangers, it can become very dangerous. A novice can become frightened, grab your arms, things like that. And so Utah Steve had a series of jumps that if you wanted to be certified, you had to take him on. as a passenger, and he would do things that passengers would do that would create danger, and you had to fix it as the instructor. And Utah Steve, I don't know how big he was. He was about 6'4" tall, and I'm maybe 5'9" on a good day. So he was the big guy on front, and I was the little guy in the back. And the graduation jump, we left the aircraft, and he put us on our backs, spinning. And in an unstable position like that, with more than 400 pounds of weight, we were going over 210 miles an hour in free fall, which is unbelievably fast. I mean, even as an experienced skydiver, it felt like my clothes were being ripped off my body by the air.
Because the average was 120 was the sweet spot, right?
Yeah,
So
maybe,
like
or even less. You know, if you're in stable free fall on your bellies, but we were on our back spinning, and spins are very dangerous because the centrifugal force puts blood into your brain under pressure. I mean, essentially, your blood pressure goes up to 300 or something, and so you don't want to spin like that. And I had to flip the two of us over and get us stable and face to earth, and then throw out a drogue parachute to slow us down to 120. And it was difficult, but he made everyone go through that because it was essentially the worst situation you could be in. And he felt that if you demonstrated the ability to solve the worst position you could be in with a passenger, that you were safe to take them. And it put both of us in some danger to do that jump. But demonstrated capacity, demonstrated ability is very important in dangerous places. You can't allow someone to go forward because you think they're good enough. You have to know it. And that's what Utah Steve was all about. Great guy. I really love the guy.
I enjoyed reading the story. It was awesome. There's a lot of good stuff. Can we continue?
Do you want to wrap up with a Ukraine-related question? Because I think that might be something people particularly want.
Let's do that. The DTAC Ukraine, you did an interview recently. Could you talk about the presentation and leadership, and what was the purpose of that?
Well, sure. I was contacted by DTAC, which is a conglomerate. It's the largest employer in Ukraine. And they wanted me to do a presentation on in extremis leadership to help people in Ukraine understand how to lead under extremely acute crisis when people are afraid for their lives. And they live streamed it on Facebook and on YouTube and recorded it for other forms of distribution. And their learning is led by the DTEC Academy, which is a corporate university similar to GE's Crotonville in the United States and that sort of thing. And I became really enamored with this team over there. And so consequently, we're now working to flesh out an idea where we'll form a large-scale group of coaches, 500 or more, and we'll use those coaches to increase the efficiency, effectiveness, and resilience of senior business leaders and government leaders in Ukraine to accelerate the recovery of their country. Nothing like that's ever been done in history before. We may or may not be successful, but we're going to give it a try. We're working with the CEO of the International Coaching Federation to see how much they might want to be involved. If I give myself an honest appraisal of the probability of success, I'd say it's about 75%. And I figure if it was 100%, I'm not taking enough risk. I'm not pushing the envelope enough. So I'm pretty satisfied with it right now. I really, my heart goes out to Ukraine. And if I were younger, I'd probably be over there. And but in my current role, this is the best way I can help, I think.
I think great leadership will help a lot, in the rebuilding of Ukraine, and this is a great initiative. This brings us to the last question. This podcast is about identity capital. With all the experience you have today, if time goes back, you're just going to college, you're just graduating, or mid-career, how do you tell people why leadership is important, and what are the lessons that only learned by experience you would tell them if you had the opportunity to go back and with all the knowledge to change or do something in terms of leadership?
Yeah. Well, first, why is it important, or why is leadership necessary? You can have a terrific education, or you can have terrific experience, but leadership, leading other people, becomes the way that you can apply your education to some level of significance. So you can be kind of a backroom person your whole life, and that's fine. But the reality is, if you can get other people to work with you and to do things in alignment with your goals and have them think it's their idea, be enthusiastic about it, you can accomplish so much more in the world.
Absolutely.
And so that's really what we try to do for Rice students, is give them a way to apply the terrific education that they're getting here. So, and I guess the most important lesson I learned over all that time is that leadership excellence is not about the person, the leader. It's about their ability to give other people what they need. So the lesson is, it's not about you. If you're a leader, it's not about you. It's about these other people you're trying to influence. And so that means you have to be very agile. Sometimes they need a very gentle, collaborative leader. Other times they need a kick in the butt.
Yeah.
And you have to give people what they need at any given time, rather than having some sort of fixed leadership style.
Thanks, Tom. This is a great book, An Extremist Leadership. This is Identity Capital.